Pat Boone for Hoffy Hot Dog.
You know, before Knott's Berry Farm became known as an amusement center, it had a reputation for good food. Hoffy hot dogs are part of that reputation. They're the official hot dog of Knott's Berry Farm. Now, these same lean meat hot dogs are available in supermarkets near you. So, have a Hoffy, the favorite hot dog of Knott's Berry Farm and the Pat Boone family.
Mr. Boone, you forgot your milk.
Now enjoy sizzling steak and free champagne in Tourist on all Delta mealtime flights to Dallas-Fort Worth. Delta is ready when you are.
Channel 7, KABC-TV, Los Angeles.
We are canceling the remainder of our regular program scheduled for this evening in order to bring you the following special report. From one end of the nation to the other, and from overseas, ABC News will present live and continuous coverage of the developments surrounding today's presidential activities, with emphasis on how these events affect this nation.
Times Square is emptying out now, and New York's millions are heading home with extra editions of the daily papers detailing the crisis which has engulfed Richard Nixon and his presidency. The twilight calm of Chicago finds the residents moving toward the security of familiar gathering places. People seem to want to be together. They want to help one another try and understand what a resignation will mean and what lies ahead. Chicago, like much of the country, is trying to hurry through a day so that thoughts can be ready to receive the address by President Nixon, an address that will probably signal an end to a tumultuous 28 years in public office. I'm Harry Reisner.
I'm Howard K. Smith in Washington. Here in Washington, there's been a light rain for much of the day, and our mood has been rather like that, somber, expectably somber. Even our resident humorist, Art Buchwald, wrote an intentionally not funny column today. It was a kind of imaginary chat with dog checkers around the question of where did such a wonderful career go wrong. Democrats are not gloating. It could backfire if they displayed a mood like that, and Republicans have nothing to gloat about. But as Senator Aiken said yesterday in response to a question, if they thought on the Hill that Mr. Nixon were going to put a voluntary end to this situation, there would be relief on Capitol Hill. Well, they think so, and there is relief. At the White House, a meeting is going on. There are 5 members of Congress meeting with the president. The members of Congress are James Eastland, the president pro tem of the Senate, the man who's third in line for the presidency, a Democrat. Senator Mansfield of Montana, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate. Senator Hugh Scott, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. And from the House, Carl Albert, second in line to the presidency, the Speaker of the House, and the leader of the Republicans in the House, John Rhodes of Arizona. ABC White House correspondent Tom Jarrell is there. Let's go to him. Tom?
Howard, the president is now meeting in his executive office building with the 5 members of Congress that you just referred to. We saw him climbing the steps going into his EOB office as we came to make this broadcast. The day here has been one which seems to be unreal. It is bizarre. It is very sad. The White House has tried to keep this from being a carnival atmosphere, but there have been major problems. They've succeeded in keeping news cameras off the lawns, but outside the lawns, crowds have stood around, singing, chanting, many just standing and looking through the gates at the White House most of today. Inside, the unreal climate is compounded by the routine grinding out of news releases. There have been about of judges and that sort of thing. The president, in one of his last, perhaps his last congressional act, vetoed an agricultural appropriations bill. So
not only the Republic has troubles, television still has troubles. We've temporarily lost our line to Washington. Now we're going to go back to Washington. We're going to try it.
As I was saying, from the on the inside of the White House, much has been going on as it were a normal day, as if it were. There's been a turning out of news releases, appointment of judges, the veto of an agricultural appropriation bill. But of course, it is anything but normal. The faces are very sad. I've seen some of the veteran White House aides who I've seen travel with the president over these 6 years, their eyes red from having wept, others with tears in their eyes as they talk to newsmen. It has been a day where secretaries who have worked in the West Wing for the president in the White House, many have sat sort of stunned at their desk. Others have been weeping openly, others sort of laughing nervously, many unsure exactly what the future will be holding. They have been assured, the lower-level White House assistants, that they have no need to worry for their future and for their jobs. The president we saw only briefly, and that was just a few moments ago. He was going from the Mansion section across West Executive Avenue and up the stairs into his EOB office. He was wearing a blue suit for television tonight. I believe he had on a blue shirt. He was walking very slowly with a Secret Service man some distance behind him. There are probably 30 to 40 stairs that he must climb as he goes into the EOB office. We've seen him climb those many times, and almost always he sort of springs up them, very seldom using the handrail for much more than just guidance. But tonight he looked very tired. He walked very slowly as he climbed each step, very methodically moving up. He turned and he saw reporters, a few standing in the driveway looking over. They saw him, and he then looked out to the street where there was some chanting and singing of hymns going on. He didn't wave. He just looked rather sad and went on into his EOB office. ABC's Bill Zimmerman has been here, and he's been following the day's developments also.
For Gerald Ford, as for the president and everyone here at the White House, Tom, it has been anything but a normal day as well. Ford's day began very early. He left his home before or just after 7:30 this morning for the long drive into Washington, about a half hour. He met, of course, in a very presumably eventful meeting with the President of the United States for 70 minutes. He attended a Medal of Honor ceremony. He attended a long meeting, had Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in for perhaps an hour and a half, an hour and 40 minutes. He issued a statement shortly thereafter indicating very strongly what he has indicated very strongly previously, that he believes Secretary of State Kissinger has done a brilliant job in the foreign policy area, that he would like to have Secretary of State Kissinger stay on in the job, and that he has reason to believe Secretary of State Kissinger will stay on in a Ford administration. Ford's staff has been very difficult to get to today. They've been extremely busy, of course. First, they have postponed and then repostponed and finally canceled a scheduled 12-day trip to the West Coast and Hawaii, which was to begin today by the Vice President. They have had to call all of the people involved with that trip, have had to cancel out all of the engagements they had scheduled. They have been busily preparing for the transition, we're told, for about 2 days, and they've been busy. They have had no comment, and it seems slightly ironical that the Vice President, who is known as an open, accessible man, has been very hard to get to today. Now back to you, Howard.
Thank you, Bill. Tom Gerald at the White House. This is clearly one of those formative days in American history. If the difficult situation is handled one way, it could bring tranquility to the nation and progress from our present situation. If it's handled in a different way, it could bring acrimony and division. That is to a great extent in the hands of the president and what he says tonight, but to some extent in our hands, and we're going to be very careful about it. Harry?
The president speaks to the nation at 9 o'clock, Washington time, New York time, Eastern Daylight Time. And while it is assumed that everyone knows he will announce his resignation, no one has a text, nobody but he knows what he is going to say. In the time remaining before Mr. Nixon speaks, we're going to visit a few of some 24 locations at home and abroad where we have live cameras set up. We sample the anticipation and the puzzlement and the sorrow, and I suppose in some cases the optimism that variously grips people around the country and around the world. We're going to begin here in New York with ABC's Roger Grimsby.
Times Square may be the best known location in New York City, but it also approaches being the least representative. Nevertheless, the initial reaction here and elsewhere in New York City to the expected announcement of a Ford in the U.S. future has sponsored more condemnation than contemplation, more disdain than pain has been expressed. That is not to say there has not been an acceleration in the spate of resignation jokes. It is not unusual in times of crisis that the immediate reaction be sort of a silly season. There is evidence of that here in New York City. The reflection, the appreciation of the enormity of the moment, that comes later with a perspective that only time can bring. There is no wave of panic here in New York City. The counterclimb of Wall Street perhaps being the best evidence that important money feels resignation is best. In the last presidential election, New York City voters gave President Nixon a margin of 846,000 votes. Because 3 million votes were cast in the city, that cannot be construed as a landslide. But considering the history of New York voting, it certainly can be considered a major margin for President Nixon. Given time to reflect, no matter for whom you voted, this...
Roger Grimsby in New York. Now we go back to Howard K. Smith in Washington.
Well, we're going to have some reports from many cities now. Some of the cities I don't even know the names of. We're going first, though, to Capitol Hill, where ABC correspondent Sam Donaldson is waiting. Sam?
Howard, Bob Clark and I, of course, have been on Capitol Hill all day. The mood of the House of Representatives is one of sadness and one of relief, in perhaps that order. There are no Democrats over there cheering tonight, at least I can't find any. This is a very sober occasion, and that's what the House thinks of it. But there is the feeling of relief that perhaps the trauma that's stopped business up here for so long is over, and the House and the country can move forward. Bob, I know that Republican caucus of senators ended just a few minutes ago. What was the mood there?
I'd have to say, Sam, that the mood was much the same. It was sad and solemn, but tinged with hope that the long ordeal of the Republican Party and the country is now over. Senator Javits came out and said he hoped that Jerry Ford, the new president, and everybody was being very careful to say that we don't know for certain yet that there will be a new president, but that Jerry Ford, if he is president, will be able to redeem Richard Nixon's pledge to bring the country together. And I think that's a strong hope here among all Republicans.
Yes, in the House, the emphasis when anyone talked about Ford, and of course that was every 30 seconds, was on his integrity, on his ability to bring the country together, and that he will project an image of honesty and one the country can rally around.
We have a little problem of how long the honeymoon will be, Sam, and I'm sure you're in the House. There'll be much the same situation. Jerry Ford is very close, and we should be saying Vice President Ford and getting used to saying Mr. President. But Mr. Ford is very close in political ideology to President Nixon. And the idea that somehow, there's much talk around the Hill today, that everybody is going to rally around the new president and help him during these crucial days ahead, I don't think that honeymoon will last very long. We still have a great difference between the Nixon administration program, which will now become the Ford administration program, and the program of this Democratic-controlled Congress. And there are a lot of liberal Democrats who will be going at Mr. Ford very aggressively within a very few weeks.
That's true, Bob. Howard, if I may take just a moment to talk about this issue of immunity. We really haven't had a chance today to explore it very well. And that is the question of some understanding that Mr. Nixon, should he leave office, would not have to face any civil or potential criminal actions. It's the view of the House leadership, both Republican as well as Democratic, that Congress, one, probably doesn't have the power to grant a bill of immunity, and number two, it would not be appropriate for Congress to do so. And yet I want to stress that I detected nothing in that which meant that it was the wish of the leadership that the president should be prosecuted should he leave office. On the contrary, the wish of people that I've talked to in the House cloakrooms on both sides of the aisle has been that the country, if Mr. Nixon leaves office, should leave him alone. It's just that they don't want to formally try to do something in a legislative sense.
Well, Sam and Bob, you know, even if the government chooses to give the president immunity, they can only give him immunity from government suits. If a private citizen, a taxpayer, wants to sue the president for tax reasons, or indeed someone whose phone has been tapped wants to sue the president, as Henry Kissinger has been sued by one whose phone was tapped, the government can do nothing about that. Those are private citizens' suits. And so immunity would be very limited even if the government wanted to give it.
That's very true, of course, Howard, but still I think a sense of Congress resolution that the president should not be prosecuted would carry very great weight with the special prosecutor, with the attorney general, with the new President Ford, who had to make those decisions. We had a difference of opinion between the Senate and the House today, quite interestingly, and Senator Edward Brooke, who, of course, was the first Republican senator to call for Mr. Nixon's resignation several months ago, today became the first to introduce a sense of Congress resolution that the president not be prosecuted. But then as he went on to explain that resolution, he made it very plain that he wants a full admission of guilt from the president before that resolution would take effect. And as we chatted with him at length this morning, he surprised me by saying that he would keep that resolution hanging, let it go to committee and hang in the Senate for months if necessary, even to the point of seeing what Mr. Nixon might have to say as a witness if he is called as a private citizen to testify at the still pending Watergate trials.
Bob and Sam, what about that? He's called to testify as witness number one at the trials of Ehrlichman and Haldeman and others. If the facts are what they seem to be, those men could be found guilty and could be sent to prison. Is it conceivable that the man they worked for and who gave the orders could go back to his office free, while they who obeyed his orders could go to prison?
Well, that is the troublesome question. And that is why the House leaders and people in the House that I've talked to do not want Congress to attempt to pass any bill of immunity, leaving aside for the moment the question of whether Congress has the power. They do not want to say to the country, this man is above the law. Let me add carefully again that they see no reason to try to pursue him in the courts. And yet they don't want to have to say to the country, we are exempting him from the treatment that any other citizen would receive. I think it just comes down to common sense, Howard. I think it comes down to the will of this country to not try to extract, if I may put it this way, the last pound of flesh. I detect in the House of Representatives, at least, no desire to do that. A desire that the country might be better served if Mr. Nixon chooses to step down. To allow him to do this in as much grace and dignity as can be mustered on both sides, to then try to let him alone while it puts its eyes forward on Gerald Ford and the business of the Republic. I hate to sound like a civics lecture, but that's really the way I think most people in the House of Representatives feel tonight.
But Howard, still another point that is going to be raised, and raised very seriously in the Senate regarding immunity, is that of amnesty for Vietnam veterans. Senator Hart of Michigan already raised it today, and he's prepared to take it to the floor. The idea, can we in good conscience as a nation refuse amnesty to not Vietnam veterans, but to persons who left the country and did not fight in the Vietnam War, and at the same time vote amnesty to a president who has confessed to what amounts to obstruction of justice. You're going to be hearing considerably more about that point from Senate liberals in the next few weeks.
Thank you very much. I think that indicates that we're not cutting a Gordian knot tonight. We're going to still have some loose ends that have to be tied up. It's going to be still a little complicated, though I think the main problem may, if all the rumors are true, be solved. Harry?
We'll be talking about the main problem and the subsidiary problems and how the country and the world feel about them in the time remaining before President Nixon tells us whether that main problem has found a resolution. And we'll continue that with Howard when our coverage of President Nixon's night continues after this message.
My dog's better than your dog. My dog's better than yours. My dog's better, so he gets kennel ration. My dog's better than yours.
Kennel ration. It's like the best of meaty and dry dog foods mixed and ready to eat. And it's the only leading canned dog food government inspected for wholesomeness. Check the labels. Government inspected kennel ration.
My dog's better than yours.
ABC News and the country are awaiting the speech to the country by President Nixon at 9 o'clock New York and Washington time, a speech which is almost unanimously believed to contain his announcement of resignation. That means that at some point in the near future, we will have a new president, Gerald Ford of Michigan. For the first time in history, we will have a man as president who has never been elected to anything on a national vote. He's been elected for a long time, since 1948, I think, by 2 counties in Michigan to be a representative, but he was the first man to be appointed vice president under the 25th Amendment, and he will be the first man to succeed to the presidency upon resignation of a president rather than death. This is the kind of thing that is occupying the country and our attention tonight before the president actually speaks. Questions like, well, what happens to Richard Nixon if he does resign? I just heard a discussion of the various aspects of what immunity is possible to grant to him, and whether it is the mood of the Congress and of the American nation that he should indeed have immunity. We'll be continuing to sample opinion, to look at what the country is thinking, what the world is thinking, and at 9 o'clock New York time to see what Richard Nixon is thinking. Howard?
Sam Donaldson is on Capitol Hill, and he's talking with a Republican congressman who was one of the major swing voters in the House Judiciary Committee hearings and debate last week, Robert McClory of Illinois. Sam?
Howard, Mr. McClory was one of 7 Republicans who joined to vote for an article of impeachment in the committee. What is your reaction tonight?
Well, I'm sure that the impeachment inquiry contributed to the president's resignation at this time, but I think that this is a very good solution. We're very grateful that he's seeing fit to resign instead of putting the country and the Congress through the ordeal of extensive debates in the House and a trial in the Senate. So I think, first of all, we should express gratitude that he's stepping down not only in his own interest, but in the national interest as well.
Mr. McClory, we were discussing a moment ago this question of immunity for Mr. Nixon should he step down. Immunity from further civil or potential criminal prosecution. What's your thought?
Well, I'm sure that we don't have any authority whatever to relieve him from any civil immunity. The subject of criminal immunity, of course, is one that is involved in the law, but I think it would be quite inappropriate for the Congress to either pass legislation or even to adopt a sense of the Congress resolution to express our desire for immunity. On the other hand, let me say that as far as I know, the members of the House, by and large, Republicans and Democrats, are not interested in pursuing Mr. Nixon beyond his resignation from office. I've talked to the Speaker of the House. I've talked with Mr. Rodino, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. They're not interested in pursuing him in any criminal proceedings, and I think that he can rest assured that following his resignation, he's really suffered I suppose the greatest penalty that a man can suffer, to step down from the highest office in the land to this sort of disgrace which is bound to follow his resignation.
Mr. McClory, you have been much too busy recently, I'm sure, to give the matter much, if any, thought. But very soon, and within a matter of days or weeks, your committee is going to have to take on another major assignment, and that will be conducting hearings on the confirmations of whoever Mr. Ford, assuming he becomes president tomorrow, picks as a vice president. Have you given much thought to that?
Well, Bob, I haven't given a great deal of thought to that, but what you say is exactly right, and we'll probably have hearings, open hearings, televised hearings, as we did in the case of the confirmation hearings of Mr. Ford. So we'll be busy again with another assignment under the 25th article.
Well, let me ask who you would like to see Mr. Ford select as a vice president.
Well, I don't have any hesitancy in saying that I'm very much in favor of Nelson Rockefeller. He was a classmate of mine at Dartmouth College, a fraternity brother, and in my opinion, he would give great stature, great leadership to this administration, and would provide the kind of respect for government that is going to be, of course, characterized by Mr. Ford, but he could, in my opinion, assist Mr. Ford a great deal in foreign affairs and his knowledge of domestic issues as well, and Rockefeller would certainly be my man.
It was pretty well agreed at the time Mr. Ford underwent hearings both before the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Rules Committee on his confirmation as vice president, that he underwent the most searching inquiry ever given any nominee by Congress, and that was including into his personal finances and taxes and so on. Would you expect that whoever the new vice presidential nominee is, that your committee would want to go into him just as thoroughly as it did Mr. Ford?
Well, I can attest to the thoroughness with which we investigated Mr. Ford. I would think that we'll make some changes. I think that the impeachment inquiry meetings and the televising of those sessions demonstrated a little higher level of service on the part of our House Judiciary Committee, and I would expect that in the confirmation hearings of Mr. Rockefeller, whoever it happens to be, who was named as vice president, will be a little more orderly, perhaps not quite as long drawn out, and I don't think we should get into matters of personal privacy to the extent that we did in Mr. Ford's case.
Thank you very much, Robert McClory, Republican of Illinois. Howard?
One swallow doesn't make a summer, but two voices for Rockefeller may make a Rockefeller bandwagon, provided one is McClory's, who is a rather conservative Republican. Rockefeller has a reputation as being a rather liberal Republican. And the other voice is Ford's. Ford is a friend of Rockefeller's, has been pointedly friendly with him, and serves on Rockefeller's public questions panels. I think Virginia Sherwood is at the White House sampling the opinion of people there. Let's go to the White House and Virginia Sherwood.
Yes, Howard, I am here. I've been here all day. I've been watching the mood of the White House, and I've heard a lot from a lot of White House aides. But to put it in the words of Gerald Warren, he said, we're all holding in there. And he said, the big question, I guess, I went in his office and talked to him, is he said, everyone wants to know, was it worth it? And he said, to me it was. It was worth it to all of us. And all of the girls and all the men who worked for him seemed to think it was worth it. As Tom Gerald's already told you, there were tears today. One girl, one press aide from the press office, went around taking pictures of all of her colleagues at their desk. And then she came to the press room and started taking pictures there, tears streaming down her face, as if perhaps they'd never be there again. Over in the East Wing, I'm told by people who've seen her very recently that Mrs. Nixon is holding up well, that she is the strength, but not quite the rock, because the rock, they tell me, is President Nixon himself. All day long, Gerald Warren told me he ran into the president this morning as he was coming to work, the president coming out of his office, hit him on the shoulder and said, "Hi, Jerry," with a big grin. I'm told by other aides here that he has made himself have a big smile on his face whenever he saw any of his aides, building up all of the people here. Then I was told by one very close aide that he really is the rock. He is holding up the rest of the family. The girls are taking it very, very hard, Julie especially. I talked to someone who saw Julie yesterday. Julie has really broken down and really feels very badly about this, naturally, as do the rest of the family. Tricia, too, is taking it very hard. Of course, Mrs. Nixon, the hurt is there, as people who've talked to her have said. They can feel it, they can see it, but she's holding up for him. We have just found out, Howard, that the president will tell the nation tonight that he intends to resign, that he will fly to San Clemente tomorrow morning with part of his family, with Mrs. Nixon and part of his family. I'm not sure that all of them will be going, and he will be flying as president in Air Force One. Do you have any questions there, Howard?
Well, I just wondered, are the two sons-in-law present, too, with the two daughters?
My IFB. Give me the IFB.
Virginia, are the two sons-in-law present with daughters Julie and Tricia?
Howard, I'm sorry, I lost the IFB. Can you give me that?
Well, I was wondering if the whole families of the daughters are there. They're two husbands, Julie's husband, David, and Tricia's husband, Edward Cox.
Yes, the families did arrive here, and they have been here some time. The whole family had dinner together last night. As a matter of fact, it's reported here that the family tried very hard to talk the president out of this resignation speech tonight, but the president was firm. Also, I'm told by Jerry Warren that there have been 10,000 phone calls alone today urging the president to stay in there, not resign.
Well,
this is Virginia Sherwood from the White House.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Harry, we're going through a very dramatic day here in Washington. You got any reports on what people elsewhere think about this?
Well, it's reasonably dramatic here in New York, Howard. I think one of the interesting things which has been reflected in the comments from senators and congressmen that you've seen in Washington is that it's not even for the people who have not liked Richard Nixon for a long time and who were sorry to see him elected, it's not a day of joy for them. And probably the people who are most demanding vengeance and most reluctant to grant amnesty are not the long-time Nixon dislikers, but the people who supported him and who somehow feel cheated. Wouldn't you think that's so? In other words, Senator Brooke, who was always lukewarm toward the president, says give him amnesty.
Yeah.
People who were his loyal friends say let the law take its course.
It was noticeable in the House Judiciary debate on impeachment that the one thing that really infuriated the conservative Republicans, was the second article, abuse of power. They are opposed to big government, and when big government is abused, they are shocked, and conservatives have been shocked. Harry?
ABC News will be back with more coverage of this historic night following station identification.